Sing, goddess, the wrath of Achilles, son of Peleus. So begins the Iliad, the epic poem of Homer, composed around 750 BC, at a transformational moment in the history of Greece, almost precisely the same moment when the alphabet enters the Greek world, and also the moment when we see the very beginnings of the Greek polis, the city-state, an age that would see tremendous economic and cultural and political advances across the Greek world. And Homer is our witness to it all. His Iliad is not only an extraordinary literary achievement, a literary monument that can move us to tears to this day. It's also a precious, priceless, historical witness to the very first days of the polis in the Greek world. The Iliad is a poem of justice. It's a story about justice. It's a story that begins with the wrath of Achilles, one of the Greek heroes, who's been moved to profound anger by one of the other Greek heroes, one of the other Greek kings. Now, as you read the Iliad, you notice immediately that the Greeks, or the Achaeans, as they're most often called in the poem, the Achaeans are in fact a confederation of different Greek societies that have banded together in a great expedition. Now, Homer's poem, one of the features of it that makes it so remarkable, isn't in fact the story of the Trojan War. The Trojan War, the great siege of the city of Troy and the sack of Troy, in fact, are only the backdrop of the story. The story would have been familiar to all listeners who heard this poem around the Greek world. The Greeks had formed a confederation and launched an unprecedented expedition to lay siege to Troy because one of the princes of Troy, Paris, had stolen Helen, the wife of the Greek king Menelaus. And it was an expedition to recover his stolen wife, his abducted wife, and to exact revenge on the Trojan society for this crime that had been committed by one of its princes. So the background of the story is a crime and a search for revenge. In the Iliad, Homer chooses to focus not on the story of the Trojan War, but instead on the wrath of the hero Achilles. And at the beginning of the poem, we see that the hero Achilles is full of anger. The Greeks had been afflicted with a great plague, and when they sought out a priest to tell them the cause of this plague, they learned that there was in fact a daughter of the priest of Apollo who'd been taken captive by the Greeks, and the god was punishing them for this act. So the Greeks returned the girl, who was in fact the captive girlfriend of Agamemnon, the chief of the Greek kings, the leader of the confederation. Agamemnon, in his fury at having to return this war prize, this booty, this captive that he had taken, in fact decides to seize one of the war prizes of one of the other Greek kings, Achilles, and he takes from him a girl, Briseis, that Achilles truly had fallen in love with. This is a primitive society. And Achilles is so infuriated at the injustice that he believes has been done to him. In this society, there's a certain principle of distributive justice, that people should be given what they deserve, and the great heroes like Achilles should be rewarded for their acts of valor, their heroism. And one of the ways that this society rewards the heroes is by giving them a greater share of the spoils, of the spoils of war. And when Agamemnon takes Achilles' captive girlfriend from him, Achilles decides that there's no point in it anymore. And he goes and he cries to his mother, literally, and decides to sit out the war, to punish the other Greeks for Agamemnon's injustice. And in fact, the Iliad begins with this episode. And over the next several books, the Greeks suffer as the Trojans advance, as they benefit from the fact that Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, is sitting out. So in other words, you see that the story that Homer wants to tell juxtaposes one injustice upon another and asks you to think about the nature of justice and about the nature of revenge. The whole expedition is about a search for revenge for the abduction of Helen. The main story, the main action arises from Achilles feeling that he has been committed an injustice against him by Agamemnon. In the great scene in Book 9 of the Iliad. The leader, Agamemnon, sends an embassy of 3 men to the camp of Achilles to try and convince him. And in fact, he tries to buy Achilles back into battle. He agrees that he will pay him enormous sums of money, that he will give him so many captive girls from the spoils of war that he couldn't even imagine, that when they return from the expedition, that Agamemnon will give him lands and estates and cattle, and even one of his own daughters in marriage. He tries to undo the injustice that he's given to Achilles by making monetary recompense. But Achilles refuses to accept the offer. And in fact, it raises truly fundamental questions of justice. And Homer's asking you to consider, can there be a price put on honor? Can Achilles be reimbursed? Can this wrong be rectified through a payment that Agamemnon is willing to make? And in fact, Achilles refuses the offer. He says that his honor has been slighted and that it can't be bought. And so the Trojans continued to advance until finally Achilles' best friend, Patroclus, can no longer stand to see the Greeks suffering. And he talks to Achilles, and Achilles eventually lets his friend enter the field of battle, in fact, wearing Achilles' armor. And so Patroclus enters the battle, and he rages against the Trojans. But the greatest of all the Trojans, Hector, one of the princes of Troy, comes into battle and slays Achilles' friend Patroclus. At this news, Achilles is despondent. He weeps. He has lost his greatest friend in battle, and it calls upon his loyalty. And now Achilles feels that he should enter the battle. And in fact, in one of the greatest scenes of the whole Iliad, Achilles must be armored. He must receive new armor to enter battle because his friend Patroclus was wearing his armor and wearing his shield, and Achilles has lost his armor. And Homer contrives a scene in which the great god of the forge, Hephaestus, forges a new shield for Achilles. And Homer spends hundreds of lines describing the shield of Achilles. And sometimes students like to gloss over this lengthy description of a shield, but the Greeks relished this kind of description of the armor. And for Homer, for the poet of the Iliad, the shield of Achilles, this lengthy description of the shield and its imagery, is central to the balance of the poem as a whole. It's a symbol for the poem of the Iliad as a whole. One of the magical qualities of the Iliad is that it's actually difficult to tell, is Homer pro-war or is Homer anti-war? And in fact, the deep art of Homer is that he is both at the same time. That's to say that Homer appreciates the heroism, the valor of war that calls forth the courage of man, that really calls humans to sacrifice for one another in the most ultimate ways. But at the same time, Homer sees the tragedy of war. He understands the brutality, the violence, the animal-like violence that can overcome mankind in war. And he understands the virtues and the greatness of peace. And Achilles' shield in the Iliad juxtaposes these two themes of the Iliad, war and peace, quite literally. At the center of the shield, Homer describes 2 cities, a city that's ravaged by war and a city at peace. And it's amazing what's on the image of the city at peace. Homer says, in this city, the shield depicted 2 things. 1, a wedding, and 2, a murder trial. That's amazing to us, actually, that a murder trial would be a symbol of peace. But the way Homer describes it is beautiful. There are 2 men, he says, in the marketplace of a city, and around them are judges. The 2 men are disputing the blood price for a murder because one of the men had killed one of the kinsmen of the other man. And the kinsman was refusing to accept the money that the perpetrator, the murderer, was offering. And in the city, there's a panel of judges sitting on raised seats who are being asked to make judgment in this case. Now, this tells us 2 things. 1, this is a society where murder, where homicide law, one of the most fundamental laws of any society, still envisioned payment for the murder of a human being from the murderer to the victim's kin. But 2, it's a society that already has what we would call some judicial procedure. because this is what the poem, the Iliad, is about. It's about the civilizing process. It's about the rise of the polis. It's about the transition from revenge to justice. The poet Homer says that justice is something more than just vengeance, that corrective justice isn't simply revenge. And this is not a lesson that Achilles knows simply when he re-enters the battle. And in fact, when Achilles re-enters the battle, he goes after Hector, the villain of the Trojans who has slain his friend Patroclus. And Achilles wants one thing. He wants revenge. And he slays Hector. And after he does, he takes Hector's body and drags it behind his war chariot and drags the body, desecrates the body, trying to exact revenge. But Achilles is inconsolable. Inconsolable. He realizes that he can't slake his grief by dishonoring, by desecrating the body, by getting simple revenge. And in the amazing final scene of the Iliad, Hector's father, Priam, comes bravely to the camp of Achilles to ask for the body of his son to be returned. And in the very final scene of the book, Achilles has returned the body of Hector to his father. It's said that Achilles sees his own father in the eyes of Priam, and he begins to imagine, to sympathize, what it would feel like to be in the father's shoes. And he returns the body, and Priam takes it back. And the book, the Iliad, ends with the funeral of Hector. And it has, for generations, been a stunning and truly unexpected and unsettling ending to this great poem, which ends not with the fall of Troy, the Trojan horse, the story that was familiar to all the Greeks, but in fact ends with the funeral of Hector. And the final line of the poem is, "So they buried Hector, the breaker of horses." And it ends that way because the Iliad is a poem about justice. It's about civilization. It's about the difference between revenge and having a society like the one pictured in the city at peace on the shield of Achilles that tries to seek justice.